Thomas Morrison III was a billionaire who could buy anything except time for his dying mother. He hired Rachel Carter, the most recommended private caregiver in the state. But when Rachel walked into that hospital room, Margaret Morrison's face went pale, because Rachel wasn't just a nurse. She was the orphan girl Margaret had thrown onto the streets 20 years ago, and now she held the woman's life in her hands. The Morrison family built a $2 billion empire across Atlanta real estate. Margaret Morrison was the iron-willed matriarch who controlled everything she touched for 40 years. But behind those mansion walls lay a buried secret, one that could unravel the entire family legacy. What really happened to the orphan girl Margaret cast out 20 years ago? And now that Rachel finally held power over her former tormentor, what would she do? Morrison Empire began with Thomas Morrison Sr. in the early 1960s. He started buying undervalued properties across Atlanta during the city's turbulent redevelopment years. By the time he passed in 1985, the family controlled over 300 properties, but it was Margaret who turned inheritance into dynasty. She had married into wealth, but she built the power. Every deal, every tenant, every decision flowed through her office on the top floor of Morrison Tower. She became known as the Iron Lady of Atlanta real estate, a woman who never lost a negotiation and never forgot a slight. Thomas Morrison III grew up in that shadow of expectation. He was sent to the best schools, trained to take over the empire, and groomed to continue the family legacy. What he was not groomed for was independence. Every path was laid out before him before he could walk it himself. His father's death when Thomas was just 22 meant Margaret assumed control of both the business and her son's future. She approved his marriage, selected his home, and even chose his friends from among the children of her business associates. Thomas became a billionaire in his own right, but he lived in a gilded cage of his mother's making. But what Thomas didn't know was that his mother had learned to control people long before she controlled real estate. In 1998, Margaret Morrison walked into St. Mary's Orphanage on Atlanta's west side. She served on the board as part of the family's philanthropic image, but this visit was different. She met a 12-year-old girl named Rachel Carter. Rachel was quiet, bright, and fiercely self-sufficient. She helped the younger children with their homework and never complained about the meager conditions. Margaret saw something in those watchful eyes, not a daughter but a project, something she could shape. Over the next 4 years, Rachel became a fixture in the Morrison household. She wasn't adopted, not officially. The paperwork was never filed. She existed in a gray space between servant and family, expected to be grateful for every privilege she received. Margaret paid for her private schooling and bought her clothes, but she also made sure Rachel understood her place. She was allowed to eat at the family table only on holidays. She was introduced to guests as the help, never as family. And she was reminded constantly that everything could be taken away. Thomas, away at boarding school and then university, barely registered Rachel's presence. She was just another part of his mother's household, a quiet girl who helped in the kitchen and disappeared when important guests arrived. He never learned her last name, never asked where she came from, never questioned why a child lived in their home but wasn't really part of the family. Then Rachel turned 18 in 2002, and everything changed. Rachel had been accepted to Spelman College on a partial scholarship. She worked up the courage to ask Margaret for help with the remaining tuition. She had lived in the Morrison home for 4 years. She had been obedient, grateful, and useful. She thought she had earned some investment in her future. Margaret's response was swift and devastating. She told Rachel that the family had already given her enough, that ungrateful girls should not expect handouts forever. That it was time for Rachel to make her own way in the world. Rachel was given 24 hours to pack her belongings. Security escorted her off the property with nothing but a small bag and the clothes on her back. No money, no references, and no explanation. Thomas was never told what happened. He returned from college that summer to find the quiet girl gone, and when he asked, his mother simply said she had moved on. He never thought about her again. For 20 years, Rachel Carter rebuilt her life from nothing. She worked 2 jobs while putting herself through nursing school at night. She earned her license, then specialized in geriatric care. She discovered she had a gift for working with the elderly, a natural patience and attentiveness that made her invaluable to wealthy families. She built a reputation as one of the most skilled private caregivers in Georgia, hired by people who could afford the best. She never spoke about the Morrisons. She never sought them out, but she also never forgot. When the agency called with a high-paying placement for an elderly woman in declining health, Rachel accepted without asking questions. She recognized the Morrison name on the file. She knew exactly who Margaret Morrison was. And now she stood in room 314 of Atlanta General Hospital, watching the iron-willed matriarch who had thrown her away struggle for each breath. Margaret's eyes widened with recognition. Her face went pale. The young woman she had cast aside 20 years ago now controlled her medication, her meals, her most vulnerable moments. Thomas stood in the doorway, confused by his mother's visible fear. He didn't understand why the nurse his money had hired looked at his mother with such intensity. Rachel turned to him with a professional smile. She would care for Margaret Morrison exactly as the job required, but she would also uncover the truth about why she had really been cast out and the secret Margaret had been protecting for 20 years. The first 3 days passed in loaded silence. Rachel performed her duties with clinical precision. She administered medication, monitored vital signs, and adjusted Margaret's pillows with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this work for 2 decades. She spoke only when necessary, her voice calm and professional. Margaret watched her every move. The woman who had once controlled every room she entered now flinched when Rachel adjusted her IV drip. Thomas noticed the tension but couldn't understand its source. He asked his mother if she wanted a different nurse, if something was wrong with Rachel's care. Margaret refused to answer. She just stared at the ceiling, her jaw tight, her hands trembling beneath the sheets. Thomas tried to talk to Rachel directly. He caught her in the hospital corridor on the 4th day, coffee in hand, and asked if there was history between her and his mother. Rachel looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. She said she had grown up in Atlanta and that his mother had been involved with the orphanage where she spent her childhood. She said nothing more. Thomas walked away more confused than before, sensing there was something deeper beneath the surface but unable to piece it together. His mother had never mentioned any connection to an orphanage. As far as he knew, Margaret Morrison had no interest in charity beyond what looked good in the society pages. Margaret Morrison had spent 40 years making people fear her. Now she was afraid. Rachel could see it in the way the old woman's breathing quickened whenever she entered the room. She could feel it in the way Margaret's eyes tracked her movements, searching for some sign of what Rachel intended to do, but Rachel did nothing. She followed every protocol, documented every medication, and provided care that was beyond reproach. If anyone reviewed her charts, they would find nothing but excellence. This was her revenge in a way, the worst kind. Margaret had to lie there, helpless, knowing exactly who Rachel was, while Rachel smiled and called her ma'am and treated her with perfect kindness. But Rachel hadn't come back after 20 years just to watch Margaret suffer. She had come for answers. On the 5th night, Thomas went home to shower and sleep in his own bed. Rachel stayed in the hospital room as she often did during overnight shifts. Margaret was awake, her breathing shallow but stable, her eyes fixed on the television mounted on the wall. Rachel sat in the chair beside her bed, watching the rise and fall of the old woman's chest. Then she spoke, her voice quiet and measured. She asked Margaret why she had really been thrown out 20 years ago. She said she knew it wasn't about the college tuition. A woman like Margaret Morrison didn't cast aside a useful asset over a few $1,000s. There had to be another reason. Margaret's face went rigid. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then she turned her head toward Rachel, her eyes hard and cold despite her fragile state. She told Rachel that some doors were better left closed, that the past was the past, that Rachel should focus on her job and stop asking questions that wouldn't bring her any peace. Rachel leaned forward and asked one more question. She asked what Margaret was so afraid of. Margaret didn't answer. She turned her face toward the wall and closed her eyes, refusing to speak another word that night. Then Rachel found the photograph. It happened by accident 2 days later. Thomas had brought a box of personal items from his mother's home, things she had requested to make the hospital room feel more familiar. Family photographs, a few books, her favorite shawl. Rachel was unpacking the box when she saw it, a framed picture tucked beneath a knitted blanket. It was an old photograph, yellowed at the edges, showing a young couple standing in front of a building she recognized, St. Mary's Orphanage. The man was Thomas Morrison Sr., the founder of the Morrison Empire. But the woman beside him wasn't Margaret. It was someone else, someone younger, with a gentle smile and eyes that looked strangely familiar. Rachel turned the photograph over. On the back in faded handwriting were a date and a location. June 1979, St. Mary's, and beneath that 2 words, Clara and Thomas. Rachel felt her breath catch. Clara. Her mother's name had been Clara. Clara Carter, who had died when Rachel was 4 years old, who she barely remembered except for the smell of lavender and the sound of her voice singing lullabies in the dark. What was Thomas Morrison Sr. doing with Rachel's mother in a photograph from 1979, and why was it hidden among Margaret's belongings? Rachel pocketed the photograph and said nothing. That night, after her shift ended, she went to the public library and searched through old newspaper archives. She found what she was looking for in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, dated August 15, 1979. A brief article about a car accident on the outskirts of the city. A single vehicle had crashed into a ravine late at night. The driver, a woman in her mid-20s, was pronounced dead at the scene. Her name was Clara Carter. There was no mention of a child, no mention of the Morrison family, nothing that connected this tragedy to the powerful dynasty that controlled half the city's real estate. But Rachel kept digging. She found another article from 6 months earlier, a Society page piece about Thomas Morrison Sr. and his wife Margaret attending a charity gala at St. Mary's Orphanage. The photograph showed the couple smiling for the camera, surrounded by children and nuns. The caption mentioned the Morrisons' ongoing support of the institution and their personal involvement with the children's welfare program. Rachel read the article 3 times. Her mother's name didn't appear anywhere in the text, but the dates lined up. Thomas Morrison Sr. had been at St. Mary's in early 1979. Her mother was there too, photographed with him in June. And in August, Clara Carter was dead in a car accident that barely made the local news. Rachel returned to the hospital the next morning with new purpose. She looked at Margaret differently now, not just as the woman who had cast her out, but as someone who might know what really happened to Clara Carter. Margaret was awake when Rachel entered the room, her color slightly better than the day before. She watched Rachel with the same wary expression she had worn all week, but Rachel didn't ask any questions that morning. Instead, she went about her duties with the same professional calm she had maintained since day one. She was waiting for the right moment. Because Thomas Morrison Sr. had a secret that his wife had buried alongside him. Rachel found more evidence over the following days. A letter tucked inside one of Margaret's books, written in Thomas Sr.'s handwriting, mentioning a Clara and expressing regret about arrangements that needed to be made. A hospital record among the personal effects, documenting a birth at St. Mary's affiliated clinic in February 1980, 5 months after Clara's death. The baby's name was listed as Rachel Carter. But the father's name was listed simply as TM. The mother was listed as Clara Carter, deceased. And in the margin, someone had handwritten a note, child to orphanage, family unaware. Margaret had known she must have known. Her husband had fathered a child with another woman, a woman who died under circumstances that might not have been an accident. And Margaret had spent the next 40 years covering it up. When Rachel appeared at St. Mary's as a 12-year-old orphan, Margaret didn't just see a charity case. She saw her husband's illegitimate daughter living evidence of his betrayal, a threat to everything she had built. She brought Rachel into her home not out of kindness, but to control her, to keep her close and silent, to make sure the girl never learned who she really was. Then Rachel asked about college tuition, and Margaret panicked, because sending Rachel away wasn't about money. It was about preventing her from getting an education, from becoming independent, from having the resources to investigate her own past. Margaret had been protecting a secret for 20 years, and now Rachel stood in her hospital room holding the evidence that could destroy the Morrison legacy forever. The document listed Rachel's birth mother, a woman named Clara Carter, and beside her name, 4 words that changed everything. Cause of death, undetermined. Those were the 4 words handwritten on Clara Carter's death certificate in the margin, a notation that should have triggered an investigation, but somehow didn't. Rachel stared at the document she had found among Margaret's personal effects, her hands trembling. The official cause listed on the certificate was single vehicle accident, but someone with medical authority had added those marginal notes, and then someone else had ensured the investigation never happened. Rachel thought about the woman she barely remembered, the smell of lavender, the voice singing lullabies. She had been told her whole life that her mother died in a car accident. She had never been told that someone had questions about how that accident really happened. Rachel hid the documents in her bag and went through the rest of her shift in a daze. She administered medication, checked vital signs, and recorded her observations with mechanical precision. Margaret watched her from the hospital bed, too weak to sit up but alert enough to know that something had shifted in the air between them. When Rachel met her eyes, Margaret looked away first. That had never happened before. In all the years Rachel had known her, Margaret Morrison had never been the one to break eye contact. She had always been the one who stared down opposition, who made people squirm under the weight of her gaze. Now she couldn't even hold the attention of the nurse she had once treated like hired help. That night after Thomas left for his home across the city, Rachel pulled her chair closer to Margaret's bed. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of monitors and the streetlights filtering through the window. Margaret was awake. She had been pretending to sleep, but Rachel could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her breathing changed when Rachel moved. Rachel spoke quietly. She told Margaret what she had found, the photograph, the birth certificate, the death certificate with its suspicious notation. She asked Margaret directly what had happened to Clara Carter in August of 1979. For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. Then her face hardened into an expression Rachel remembered all too well from her teenage years. It was the look Margaret wore when she was about to deliver a crushing blow, when she was about to remind someone of their place. but her voice, when it came, was weaker than Rachel had ever heard it. Margaret told Rachel that she was making a mistake, that digging into the past wouldn't bring her mother back, that some secrets were buried for good reasons. Rachel asked if Thomas Morrison Sr. had really been her father. Margaret's silence was answer enough. Then Rachel asked the question she had been dreading. She asked if Margaret had killed her mother. Break lines compromised. That notation appeared in a separate document Rachel found the next day, hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible among Margaret's belongings. It was a mechanic's report, dated 3 days after Clara Carter's death, detailing an inspection of the wrecked vehicle. The brake lines had been cut. The car hadn't crashed by accident. Someone had made sure Clara Carter would never leave that ravine alive, and somehow the official police report had classified the death as an accident anyway. Someone had buried the truth. Rachel's hands shook as she read the mechanic's report for the third time. The signature at the bottom was barely legible, but the date was clear. 3 days after Clara's death, someone had inspected the vehicle and found evidence of sabotage. The report was addressed to Thomas Morrison Sr. Her father had known. He had known his mistress had been murdered, and he had done nothing. Or worse, he had helped cover it up. Rachel thought about the letter she had found earlier, the one where Thomas Sr. expressed regret about arrangements that needed to be made. She had assumed he was talking about sending Rachel to the orphanage. Now she wondered if he had been talking about something much darker. Margaret's demeanor changed completely when Rachel showed her the mechanic's report. The cold iron lady of Atlanta real estate, the woman who had terrified her for decades, suddenly looked small and fragile in that hospital bed. Her face went gray. Her hands clutched at the sheets. For the first time since Rachel had walked into this room, she saw genuine fear in Margaret's eyes. Not fear of exposure or scandal, but fear of something deeper. Fear of a truth that had been buried for 43 years and was now clawing its way to the surface. Margaret started to speak, then stopped. She looked at Rachel, really looked at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Then she told Rachel something that made the room spin. She said she hadn't killed Clara. She said she had wanted to, had planned to even, but someone else had gotten there first. When Rachel asked who, Margaret just shook her head. She said it didn't matter anymore. Everyone involved was either dead or dying. She said Rachel should take whatever evidence she had found and burn it. That the truth would only destroy the people still left standing. That included Thomas, who still didn't know he had a sister walking around Atlanta, or that his father had been murdered. Murdered, Thomas Morrison Sr. had died of a heart attack in 1985 at the age of 58. At least that was what everyone had been told. Rachel stared at Margaret, trying to process what she was hearing. Margaret's eyes dropped to the sheets again. She said Thomas Sr. had been planning to leave her. He had fallen in love with Clara Carter, really fallen in love, for the first time in their arranged marriage. He had been making plans to acknowledge Rachel publicly, to bring Clara into his life, to rewrite his will. And then Clara had died in a car accident that wasn't an accident, and Thomas Sr. had known. He had known his wife was involved, and he had stayed. Rachel asked why Thomas Sr. hadn't gone to the police, why he hadn't exposed what happened. Margaret laughed, a hollow sound with no humor in it. She said the Morrisons were old Atlanta money. They didn't go to the police. They handled things privately. Thomas Sr. had evidence of what she had done, or arranged to have done, and he had used it to control her for the remaining 6 years of his life. She became the face of the company while he faded into the background. Every decision went through her. Every signature required her approval. He had stripped her of power in the only way he could, by making her live under the threat of exposure. And then he had died, and she had buried everything. The evidence, the truth, the girl who looked too much like the woman her husband had loved. But there was something Margaret wasn't saying. Rachel could see it in the way the old woman's eyes shifted, in the hesitation before certain answers. She pressed harder. She asked again who had really killed Clara Carter, if Margaret claimed she hadn't done it herself. Margaret's face went still. Then she said something that Rachel never expected. She said Clara Carter hadn't just been Thomas Sr.'s mistress. She said Clara had been working for someone else, someone who had been watching the Morrison family for years, someone who had their own reasons to want Clara silenced. Before Rachel could ask who, the door to the hospital room opened and Thomas walked in. Thomas looked between his mother and the nurse, sensing the charged atmosphere but unable to read it. He asked if everything was all right. Rachel looked at him, really looked at him, and saw it for the first time. The same jawline, the same shape of the eyes. She had spent her whole life without family, without roots, without anyone who shared her blood. And now she was standing across from the brother she never knew she had, a man who had grown up with everything while she had scraped by on nothing. A man who, through no fault of his own, represented everything that had been stolen from her. Rachel made a decision in that moment. She told Thomas she needed to speak with him privately. She led him to the small family waiting room down the hall and closed the door behind them. Thomas looked confused and concerned. He asked if something had happened to his mother. Rachel told him to sit down. She said she had something to tell him, something that would change everything he thought he knew about his family. And then she began to explain. Because Rachel Carter wasn't just the daughter Thomas Morrison Sr. had kept hidden. She wasn't just the orphan girl Margaret had tried to erase from existence. She was the key to a secret that had been buried for over 4 decades, a secret that involved murder, cover-ups, and a conspiracy that reached beyond the Morrison family itself. And as she told Thomas the truth about who she really was, about what had happened to their father and to her mother, she saw his face transform from confusion to shock to something that looked like devastation. Thomas Morrison III had spent his entire life trying to live up to his family's legacy. He had built on his father's foundation, expanded the empire, and done everything expected of him. And now he was learning that the foundation itself was rotten, that his father had lived a double life, that his mother had covered up a murder, that he had a sister who had grown up in poverty while he wanted for nothing, that everything he thought he knew about his family was a lie. He looked at Rachel with eyes that had lost their certainty and asked her what she was going to do with the evidence she had found. Rachel didn't have an answer yet. She had spent 20 years imagining what she would say to Margaret Morrison if she ever got the chance. She had never imagined this. She had never imagined that the woman who cast her out was protecting secrets that went far beyond an illegitimate child. She had never imagined that her mother had been murdered. She had never imagined that she would have to decide whether to expose a dying woman's crimes or let the truth die with her. And she had never imagined that her decision would affect a brother she had just discovered, a man who was innocent of everything but birth. And now Rachel stood at a crossroads that no one should ever have to face. Rachel returned to the hospital room alone. Thomas had stayed in the waiting room, needing time to process the shattering of everything he had believed about his family. Margaret lay in her bed, weaker than she had been all week. The monitor beside her beeped steadily, tracking a heart rate that seemed to grow slower with each passing hour. Rachel pulled her chair close and sat down. She looked at the woman who had controlled her life for 4 crucial years, who had thrown her away when she became inconvenient, who had covered up a murder and built an empire on lies. She had every reason to hate her. She had every right to expose her, but something held her back. Rachel asked Margaret one final question. She asked why she had really brought her into the Morrison home all those years ago. If Margaret had known Rachel was her husband's illegitimate daughter, why not leave her at the orphanage? Why bring the evidence of Thomas Sr.'s betrayal under her own roof? Margaret was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said it was punishment, not for Rachel, but for herself. Every day she had to look at the girl who reminded her of her husband's infidelity. Every day she had to pretend charity while feeling hatred. She had brought Rachel home to remind herself never to be vulnerable again. And when Rachel had asked for help with college, Margaret had seen an opportunity to finally remove the reminder of her husband's betrayal from her life forever. Then Margaret began to speak, and the words that came out would rewrite everything. She told Rachel about a conversation she had overheard in 1979, a few weeks before Clara's death. Thomas Sr. had been meeting with someone in his study, and Margaret had listened at the door. They were discussing Clara Carter, not as a mistress, but as a problem. Clara had discovered something about the Morrison family's business dealings, something that could have brought the entire empire crashing down. She had been asking questions, digging into records, threatening to go public with what she had found. Thomas Sr. was trying to convince the other person that Clara could be trusted, that she would never betray him. The other person disagreed. Margaret said she never learned exactly what Clara had discovered, but she knew who the other person in that study had been. It was Thomas Sr.'s younger brother, Raymond Morrison, a man who had died in a supposed hunting accident in 1982. Raymond had been the one who handled the family's less legitimate business dealings, the transactions that never appeared in official records, the arrangements that kept the Morrison empire connected to certain powerful interests across Atlanta. Clara Carter had stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to see, and Raymond had decided she was too dangerous to leave alive. Rachel felt the floor shift beneath her. Her mother hadn't been killed because of a jealous wife or a family scandal. She had been killed because she had uncovered something far bigger. She asked Margaret what had happened to the evidence Clara had gathered. Margaret said she didn't know. After Clara's death, Thomas Sr. had searched her apartment, but Clara had been smart. She had hidden her findings somewhere no one had thought to look. Thomas Sr. had spent the remaining years of his life trying to find those documents, terrified of what they might contain. He had died without ever learning where Clara had hidden her insurance policy. Because the person who ordered Clara Carter's death had never been a Morrison at all. Raymond Morrison had been taking orders from someone else, someone far more powerful, someone whose identity Margaret claimed she still didn't know. Raymond had been the family's connection to what he called the partners, a loose network of business and political figures who operated behind the scenes in Atlanta. Clara Carter had uncovered something about those partners, something that had made her a threat not just to the Morrisons, but to powerful people across the city. Killing her had been a corporate decision. The Morrisons had simply been the ones to carry it out. Rachel felt sick. Her mother had been murdered by a conspiracy, not a love triangle. And whoever had ordered her death might still be out there, might still be watching, might still have reasons to want the truth buried. She asked Margaret if she had ever been threatened. Margaret said the partners didn't need to make threats. They simply expected loyalty. When Thomas Sr. had tried to break free of their influence in the early 1980s, he had died suddenly of a heart attack. Margaret had taken the hint. She had run the company exactly as expected, asked no questions, and kept her mouth shut. For 40 years, she had lived with that knowledge, and now she was dying, and it no longer mattered what she said. Rachel spent the rest of the night at Margaret's bedside. She didn't forgive her. She couldn't, but she understood her differently now. Margaret Morrison had been a powerful woman who had never truly been in control. She had been a victim of the same system that had killed Clara Carter. She had made terrible choices, but those choices had been made under pressures Rachel had never imagined. Somewhere in the darkness of that hospital room, Rachel made peace with the past. Not by forgetting, but by accepting that some wounds never fully heal, they just stop bleeding. Margaret died the following morning. Thomas was with her, holding her hand when her heart simply stopped. There was no dramatic final breath, no last words of wisdom or regret. She just faded away like a candle that had finally run out of wick. Rachel stood in the doorway and watched the monitor flatline. She had come into this hospital seeking answers, and she had found them. But the answers had only led to more questions. Who were the partners? What had Clara discovered? And where had she hidden the evidence that had cost her everything? 3 days after Margaret's funeral, Rachel received a package at her apartment. It had no return address, just her name typed on a plain manila envelope. Inside was a key and a note written in handwriting she recognized from the letters she had found. Thomas Sr.'s handwriting. The note said simply, "She gave it to me for safekeeping before the end. I was too much of a coward to use it. Maybe you will be braver." The key had a tag attached, a number and a name. Safe Deposit Box 447, First National Bank of Atlanta. Rachel went to the bank that afternoon. The safe deposit box was registered under Clara Carter's name, opened in June 1979, 3 months before her death. Inside was a stack of documents, photographs, and a letter addressed to Rachel in her mother's handwriting. Clara had known something might happen to her. She had gathered evidence of the partners' activities, records of bribes, money laundering, and connections to organized crime that stretched across Atlanta's business and political elite, and she had made sure her daughter would one day find it. Hidden among the papers was a deed. It was for the land where St. Mary's Orphanage had stood, the property that had been sold to developers in 1995 and was now the site of a luxury shopping center. But the deed showed that the land had never belonged to the church. It had belonged to Clara Carter, inherited from her grandmother, and somehow transferred to Morrison Holdings without her consent in 1978. Clara had been investigating the theft of her own property when she stumbled onto the larger conspiracy. Her murder had been about money and power, and her daughter had grown up in an orphanage built on land that should have been her inheritance. Thomas learned the truth about his family's empire in the weeks that followed. Rachel shared everything with him, the documents, the recordings Clara had hidden, the evidence of decades of corruption. Thomas had spent his whole life building on a foundation of lies. Now he had to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. He could bury the truth again, protect the family name, and continue profiting from an empire built on blood. Or he could expose everything, tear down what his father and uncle had built, and face the consequences. Thomas made his choice. He cooperated with federal investigators, provided testimony about the family's business dealings, and turned over every document Rachel had found. The ensuing investigation took down not just the Morrison Empire, but exposed a web of corruption that had operated in Atlanta for over 40 years. Politicians, business leaders, and law enforcement officials found themselves facing charges. The partners Margaret had spoken of were finally brought to light. But the story didn't end in that hospital room. Rachel Carter had spent 20 years believing she was nobody, an orphan with no roots, no family, no name that carried any weight. She had built her life from nothing, becoming someone through sheer determination and quiet strength. But she had never known that her story began long before she was born, tangled up in the history of one of Atlanta's most powerful families. She had never known that the woman who cast her out was protecting secrets far bigger than an illegitimate child. She had never known that her mother died because she dared to question people who thought themselves untouchable. The truth is a dangerous thing. It can destroy families, topple empires, and upend everything we believe about the people we love. Rachel had a choice in that hospital room. She could have walked away, kept the secrets, and let the dead stay buried. No one would have blamed her, but she chose differently. She chose to face the past, no matter how painful, and in doing so, she gave her mother the justice that had been denied for over 40 years. Thomas Morrison III lost almost everything. The empire his grandfather built was dismantled, the assets seized, the reputation destroyed. He went from billionaire to ordinary citizen almost overnight. But when reporters asked him if he regretted his decision to expose the truth, he said only one thing. He said he finally knew who his sister was. Rachel never returned to private nursing after that. The documents her mother left behind had revealed not just corruption, but land that should have been hers. She used the settlement from the civil case that followed to start a foundation in Clara Carter's name, providing legal assistance to families fighting against powerful interests. She visits Margaret's grave sometimes, not to forgive, but to remember. Because some sins can't be absolved, they can only be acknowledged. The Morrison family thought their money could bury the truth forever, but they forgot one thing. The truth doesn't stay buried. It waits for someone brave enough to dig it up. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. Until next time, stay curious.